Bill Herbert, thank you for agreeing to this interview
Delighted
for
to be here.
Dundee University Review of the Arts, and congratulations on being appointed Dundee's Macker. So it's obvious what my opening query is going to be. What does this mean that you're going to be Dundee's Macker? What are you going to have to do? And what does this mean to you?
Well, I think first of all, it's a great honour and a great surprise to be put into this kind of position in relation to the city of your birth. You know, certainly for me, I've written about Dundee for decades. It's been one of my pervading, returning subjects, and I use it as a. I think it's Roy Fisher says about Birmingham. I use it to think with. You know, so similarly, I think of Dundee in this way. So, well, you know, the macker is a marvellous term, isn't it? It's this idea which cuts to the heart of what a poet is. You make things out of words, you make things out of language, and you hope that they communicate to an audience. To be a Dundee macker is to have a quite specific first audience of Dundonians, but then also that issue of speaking on the behalf of how you think of the Dundee spirit, the Dundee mind to Scotland and to the UK, to the world. You know, all of those are the kind of ideas that race through my mind when I think of a Dundee macker.
Okay. You mentioned the Dundee mind. Is there a mindset that goes with being Dundonian, do you think?
Well, I think there are a set of ways of behaving that you wouldn't say were exclusively Dundonian, but you would certainly say were identifiably Dundonian. And I think there's a very kind of lively, sardonic relationship between the genders in Dundee, which is to do with its specific history, and the Mike Mara song Hermless sums something of that up. The idea that the kettle boiler, the male, was often in a female position because the women were able to earn in the jute mills. That's still recent enough history to be in the genealogy, to be in the psychology, and it certainly filters through. I don't think of Dundee as being a kind of macho city in the same way as perhaps you might think of Glasgow as having that kind of characteristic, an identifiable characteristic. Jimmy, as a character, you would associate with that city. We don't really have that in Dundee. So there is that, which I think is a kind of a lively, dialogic thing going on between genders. There's also an interest in history. There's a kind of a very powerful historical imagination in Dundee. People are fascinated by their own history, their family history, their local history, and how Dundee has reflected on itself through the ages. I think there's a huge interest in that. You see it in book sales, you see it in book publication, and you see it in various societies that people throng to and are very happy to join.
Okay. Do you think Dundonians have got linguistic resources that you won't find anywhere else? I mean, you write in Scots, many good poets are now writing in Scots, at least some of the time. Is there a Dundee inflection which is distinctive within Scots?
Well, I would answer that in one syllable. There is. It is the case that the combination of East Coast Scots, the massive influx of Irish population in the 19th century, and the kind of collision between the Tuchta, the strong Doric of the northeastern part, and that kind of industrial city of that whole period from the 1840s, 1850s. Right through to the collapse of industries in the 70s and 80s and 90s has engendered a very strong linguistic resource, which a lot of Dundee writers draw on. I think there's a kind of again, an easy reach going on between the two languages, between an extreme Dundee Scots and a polite English register, in the same way as there's a dialogue between the genders, there's a dialogue between the dialects as well.
I've heard recently from a local historian that the specifically Dundee accent appears to have emerged only in the last 250 years, which surprised me, because I'd known it all my life, being Dundonian myself. So I was surprised that it was that recent. And I wondered, of course, technically, how this happened. How does an accent become distinctive? I haven't got to the bottom of that. But you're teaching in Newcastle.
Yes.
Which is Geordie land.
Which is Geordistan, indeed,
yeah.
yes,
And,
yes.
and the accent down there, of course, is extremely marked and recognisable internationally. And I wonder how, do you ever read Dundonian poems in Newcastle? And if so, how does that register with Geordies?
Geordies immediately recognise the city-specific dialect. And in fact, I've got a few poems which are written in really very bad Geordie, which I've done over the years because I've been down there almost 20 years now. So I've had the experience in both directions of reading Dundee poems to Geordies and reading Geordie poems to Dundonians. And I think, yes, they identify, they connect. Of course, I mean, historically it is part of the same English. It's Northern English, which was spoken from north of the Humber all the way up. So it's they're not distinct in that way. And one of the experiences I certainly had when I went down to Newcastle for the first time was one of recognition of A, following more of it than I thought I would rather, and B, of actually just feeling at home with the idea of it being city specific. So I've done a lot of very weird mapping of Dundee onto Newcastle and Newcastle onto Dundee in my efforts to be at home in both places now.
What will it mean to your Newcastle colleagues and to your students that you are Dundee Macker? Will that have any meaning for them, do you think?
I think it'll have a degree of meaning, because that role, if not exactly that title, is familiar down there as well. If you think about the way that Basil Bunting was seen as a writer of Northumberland, or that subsequent writers like Barry McSweeney were seen as very strongly representative figures of the city and its hinterland. I think the idea of a city-specific Macker, even if the word itself is not as familiar, is quite clear. And of course, remember that the Mackhams of Sunderland derive their name. The typical insulting nickname for someone from Sunderland, the Mackham, is straightforwardly from the same verb, Mac, because the idea was that they pronounced that word slightly differently from the Geordies, so there was shibboleth. Right. So from the Mackham to a Macker, it's not a strange event for them.
No, I mean the word Macker has a Geordie sound to it even, broad Geordie. Do you think, well, what do you think, what kind of resources do you think Scots has as a poetic language which you won't find in mainstream English or standard English or received pronunciation?
I suppose my perception of it is less of a kind of a distinct linguistic entity in that sort of way. I tend to see these things as being part of the normal resource of the Scot, so that it just shades from one to the other. And as I was saying earlier, at one point you might be speaking quite a literary English or an educated or academic English, and at the other you might very much not be. So it's more that Scots have resources in both directions rather than that Scots provides a specific additional resource. To be able to speak in an academic English is a positive and an advantage in our society in certain respects, and to be able to speak in a demotic and dialect-based Scots is a different kind of advantage. You know, I see them both as entirely positives.
Okay.
So, what specifically? When I'm writing, certainly much more satiric force, a much stronger, more aggressive use of quite lots of sweary words.
Is this because of the kinetics of the language?
Rhythmically, of course, you're much more sure of yourself. You're on much fleeter ground. Yes.
And when you say satiric, Bill, do you mean that Scots has some kind of comic resources
Yes.
that you won't find anywhere else?
Not that you'll never find them anywhere else. It's just that they manage to hit a particular pitch in Scots. The other thing I would say is tenderness as well. That Scots is a very lyric language, and so the capacity for you know, if you're a poet, you think about the genres you can cover, and the fact that you can write a good love poem in Scots is very helpful in your dealings with the ladies.
Take your word for it.
Yeah. Well, we can but try, Jim. I find that those kinds of emotional edges are rounded out much more in Scots. The language of tenderness and the language of, I suppose, abuse, if you like, are areas which Scots adds or augments English in. But it's also a language that offers kind of psychological insight in a slightly different way, because it's much less bothered with Latinate and Greek terms, and it borrows much more strongly from a Northern European base. And so you find that you're more connected to something, or the reader is more directly connected to it. And the simple one is the one we started with. Poet comes from the Greek for making in exactly the same way. Maker is a fairly straightforward translation from the Greek, but one of them sounds much more manual, much more physical, and the other sounds much more intellectual, much more removed. So that little transit between etymologies, that's something that Scots gives you.
This is kind of new to me. I'm late in the day to appreciate the resources in Dundonian, in which I never write. Although I was brought up on Broad Dundonian in the home. But one thing I've learned in recent years, I always thought of Dundonian as a great comic resource. But various poets from around here have been helping me to grasp its capacity for pathos.
Yes.
Which is is a lesson for me. It's something I hadn't been aware of. This is very close to your idea about tenderness.
I think so.
But you can also do suffering seriously in Dundonian Scots, which is a new idea to me. Bill, we're hoping that since you're here in connection with a literary festival, and you have been launching Whaleback City, which you've co-edited with Andy Jackson, who works here on campus.
This moment I will idly and innocently hold this up to the world.
Well, we were kind of wondering if you would like to read either a couple of poems from Whaleback, your own stuff, or something from Amnesia, which is your recent 2-volume.
Right. I can do the same with the Amnesia there. You get a little animation when I do that, because you can see if I rapidly alternate between volumes, the flying squid appears to move. Or you can set it up in a kind of.
I think you have to move first.
This is a camera trick. They speed it up later. See, I do this, and then they magically transform that into a flapping squid. There you go. Look at that line up there. Splendid. Yeah. I'd be very happy to. I'd be delighted to. Do you have any strong preferences? I'll certainly read something from Whaleback.
Well, perhaps one thing from Whaleback that you've written, and maybe one thing from Amnesia.
Okay.
Perhaps one of these could be in standard English
And one would
be in
Scots.
Dundonian.
That would
How
be.
does that sound?
That sounds very sensible. And again, I suppose that the reason I was fiddling around with these two things like that is because the books are dialogic. They interact with each other thematically. They contrast structures and ideas and images and languages in the way that you're just suggesting I do. For me, that ties back to what we're talking about. You know, that this is a specific resource that Scots people, Dundonian people, have is the sense that there is somewhere else they can go. There's another edge or pole or point that they can take themselves to emotionally, intellectually, or linguistically, and that these extremes are always in dialogue with each other. There's always a tension of one sort, or a tenderness, or a connection between them. So that for me, I'm always very interested when you start writing in Scots. And this isn't a digression, by the way, folks. This is a very elaborate me approaching the piece I'm going to read from this. It does join up. I didn't write in Scots. I read Burns, I read McDermott, I went to university, I studied them, and I didn't do it. I thought that it was something historically distinct. And then I came back to Dundee when I was 21 or so, and simply wrote the doldrums in a very short, intense space of time. And doldrums were a sequence in Scots, entirely in Dundonian Scots, and I'd never thought about writing it before. And so there was something of a kind of an extreme reaction to having been really quite far away intellectually, and then coming home. Something broke out or broke loose as a result of that happening. I don't think if I'd stayed at that point, I would have written in Scots. Might have happened later, could have happened at some other point. But at that point, it was specifically the experience of going away and coming back. And so the doldrum that's actually in Whaleback City is the one that's set in the street where I was brought up, Peddy Street, and it already features McGonagall as a character in my kind of my poetic psychodrama already features the great fool McGonagall, and this poem, second doldrum, is almost one of the first ones where that Dundee voice came out for the first time. So the second doldrum is called Elephant's Graveyard, and it reads like this. Where are ye, Dundee? Where's your golem buried? Where doon your pendies lux it? Broon brick, eld scour it, time, dust, choke it. Blin windies, where's McGonagall's heart? Cry seagulls echoes through closes lugs, nothing but his heart shards. Shatter it, deed, truth, dread, nothing but visions of labourers dear. I kench the street, Peddy Street, where born and raised in tenements my soul clerk shape it. I spotted you, carting a wheelbarrow, our coblies, our tarmacadam, and under 'em's the cobble stains, deed bury it, jar banes o' your wains, hopes. I saw you in grey overalls, een deed and blank, he'd bullet grey and tar smear it, dirt clung till your een. And indivisible fae your past, out of the frames of photographs, walking, weld it to wheelbarrow, hands shoulder to toil, and nae rest. Ghaist o' the 30s, Dundee when the death cam doon, grey cinders descending, meld it wi' clays and dreams. Dundee when America fell, Dundee when the depression came our seas and bide it and rest it in your father's braces, your flat bunnets, your bandy legs, your rickets, walking up a street, a deed, a ghostie, a passed by, a damnit, a worker, ghaist, restless, and never kenning green.
Thank you. You read that with some passion.
Yeah, well, It was a very kind of political stance, I suppose, that the doldrums came from. It was 1980s, early. The Tories were in power, not like now. You know, they weren't busy dismantling everything. Not like now. You know, I mean, it was, and it also seemed a very hopeless time because Labour did not offer a coherent response, arguably, and that there's no nationalist movement on the same level. Everyone was still a bit stunned by what happened at devolution. It seemed as though the Tories would reign for 1,000 years, and at the end of it, we'd, you know, they would just be machines tramping on our skulls. And it was the doldrums then was a kind of a spiritual state of complete stasis, of inertia, of if anything, entropy. If anything was going to happen, it was going to get worse. Yeah. So yeah, it came from quite a passionate place. But also it was an eruption of this voice, you know, so that came from somewhere that wasn't entirely rational. I didn't think, oh yes, I know what my career needs, I need to write in a language that nobody reads. You know, that was not a rational decision, that was something that just came about. And I had to kind of go with it because it was quite a strong impulse.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Thank you for reading that to us and talking about it. Bill, you've described yourself in years gone by as a polystylist. Is that your coinage?
Polystylism, I think it's Schnittke comes up with it, the Russian composer, as a way of describing what happened in his music, kind of post-serialist, thinking back to Shostakovich, thinking back to Romantic tradition, and he just suddenly seems to realise that actually the thing that you can do, imaginatively, is anything, if you have the technical wherewithal to bring it all together. And that actually once you allow yourself to do that, it's how the anythings interact with each other that actually is the style. Right? So you can have a bit of straightforward experimental writing, you have a bit of performance work, you can have a bit of more kind of stanzaically academic writing. And you can do all these things if you can do them technically. The interesting thing is what happens when you put them together. You start to get a meta structure in which these different modes speak to each other and construct something else, and start saying something else. And at some point I realised that was sort of what I was doing. And of course it began with just English and Scots, you know, that kind of thing, and realising that I was going from one to the other for a particular reason. And then it extended to, yes, I was doing something with comic verse, I was doing something with love poetry, I was doing something with a little bit of politics, as Ben Elton used to say way back in the 80s. And all these things gradually became like they were pieces of vocabulary or grammatical units, and I was trying to say something else using each of them, but it was the combination that actually produced the intelligible statement. You know? So that was what polystylism meant to me. It was a kind of a reason for writing slightly larger, thicker books than people normally assume poetry is written in. And that was kind of because I found those narrow little 64-page books rather monotonous stylistically. I felt that there's some really kind of highly thought of people writing 64 pages, and I was bored by page 32 because there was no variation, as it were. You know, so I realised then that my shtick was how the styles interacted, how the styles clashed, how the styles complemented.
Well, that's an interesting reply, but we're bandying this word style back and forth, and I'm doing it somewhat uncritically, and I suppose we're using it as a default term. But if pressed, how would you define style? What is it? I'm thinking something that Coco Chanel said something to the effect that fashions come and go, style doesn't. Is there an analogy to this in poetry?
Yeah.
What is style?
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to be a polystylist,
Then
then
you have to define one.
presumably you know what style is, and you
Yes.
have had your thoughts about this.
Yes. Well, I would say for me, style is a particular accumulation of voice and form. That it is the way that a voice sits in and resolves and actually redirects a form. So it's about two elements coming together, and each one changing the other. So it's a kind of a wee gestalt of those two elements. Without the voice, which comes from a particular milieu, in a particular place, in a particular time, and without the form, which may have a very different historical background, you don't get that kind of spark of something that is distinctive and recognisably that author or that generation even, because there are times when you do feel that other writers and you share certain stylistic concerns or certain modes. And certainly in the late 80s and early 90s there was a whole bunch of Scottish writers who seemed to share some stylistic concerns. Richard Price, Robert Crawford, David Kilmark, Peter McCary.
So is style the same thing as manner?
I suppose there's a manner in which you go about things, but there's always a kind of teetering between manner and mannerism, isn't there, of these things being taken.
Well, how would you define mannerism now that you've raised the word?
I would say that when these things become emblems in themselves, when they become tropes that you deliver as kind of as signs to the reader. Look, I'm doing that thing that I do. As soon as you do that thing, then you've crossed over into a mannerism. And because mostly, as soon as you do that, you need to put it to one side and do something else, actually.
But how do you do this? Because almost by definition, mannerism is something that we've all got in everyday life, but are not particularly conscious of. So somebody might point out to you, do you realise you've got this mannerism? And you'll say, no. When do I do that? Well, you're doing it now, they'll say.
Yeah.
How do you catch yourself doing this in writing, and how do you stop yourself from doing it?
Yeah. Well, I think that most poetry is about a process of increasing awareness. You know, you're moving in your work from a position of doing something unconsciously to doing it with a certain degree of self-consciousness, to doing it with a further degree of simple awareness. You understand what the use of that thing that you happened upon was and is. You know, so actually you're constantly evolving as a writer from one of those positions and through one of those positions and reaching another one. You know, and after a position of awareness in which you've said, oh, I do this particular thing. Like for instance, I use McGonagall's voice. I write every now and then a poem in which I'm either adopting McGonagall's voice or I'm using the ridiculous structure of a McGonagall poem where the delayed second rhyme and the banality of the delayed second rhyme is part of a comic effect. Right? So I do that every now and then. I'm aware of it as a kind of a recurrent mannerism. And the thing that I now do is only deploy it in an unusual or unlikely circumstance. So I actually have to take the McGonagallism somewhere new in order for it to be worth deploying at all. You know, because otherwise it's just a trick.
That's interesting. So there's a distinction between mannerism and manner, and another distinction between manner and style. Seems to be where we're getting with this conversation.
Well, we can keep on distinguishing.
Yeah,
of course. Yeah. I mean, all I would say is that the imaginative act is one of establishing distinctions and finding out what this shade adds to the thing that you're trying to do.
So if somebody were to say to you, Bill Herbert, what do you think are your current mannerisms, the things that you don't know you're doing, that you cannot help doing, because you're Bill Herbert? Are these to the forefront of your awareness, or are they buried? Are they still buried? Are they constantly coming to the fore of your awareness?
Well, you know, we've just crossed over into therapy, haven't we? Yeah.
That wasn't intentional.
I cannot by definition be aware of them all. I can only endeavour, as part of the imaginative career, to become aware of how I can use as many of them as possible, and how I must set some inevitably aside.
So is this one of the things for which a poet needs readers?
Totally, exactly so. Yes, and all levels of readers. I mean, sometimes the reader is yourself 10 years later, you know, and sometimes the reader is someone close that you work with very regularly, who you see. I mean, I've always gone to workshops. I still go to workshops now and get feedback from people who I trust. And sometimes the readers are indeed what happens when it goes into a magazine, it goes into a book, or you're at a reading, and people want to ask you questions, people come up to you, people want to deliver short statements about your general uselessness. And you know, it's a constant process of contextualising your work, but you only ever contextualise it through having a very strong sense of what the audience is doing in relation to that work.
Bill, you're very prolific.
I tend to think I'm a fairly lazy and laid-back chap who spends most of his time gazing out the window, wondering if one could reasonably at this hour pop to the pub.
But still the poems keep coming, whether you're laid back or not. It's prolificness. I don't know if that's even a word.
Prolificity.
That doesn't sound right.
Can we go with that one? Prolific. Yeah, okay.
The state of being prolific. Is that a mannerism? Is that something you cannot help? You know, some poets, the poems trickle out of them very slowly, and the final body of work, T.E. Hume, is it Ian Hamilton? Very small body of work. Other people like Shakespeare just pours out and pours out. And you're at the prolific end of the spectrum. And you know, I'm just curious, is this something that you cannot help?
I've got a very rapid capture instinct, i.e. if I get an idea for a poem, then it's down very quickly, and then it starts to be worked on. There's a huge amount of those that never go anywhere and just get thrown out. But I find that rapid capture is effectively what a prolific poet is doing. They're not letting the ideas go by them. And my feeling about that is there's many ways of being a poet as there are poets, and it's not that one of them is better or worse than the other, but some people like to have a slow capture rate where the thing has got to really kind of sink through their consciousness before the pen gets to the paper, or the fingers get to the keyboard. And for me, it's the other way round. You know, it rises to the surface and appears very rapidly.
Well, the old-fashioned word for this would have been wit.
Yes.
By which the 17th century and earlier would have meant intelligence at play.
Yes.
Not in the narrow sense we use wit now, but having your wits about you, all 5 wits about you. And this interesting. This comes across very strongly in your writing, that there is an analytic intelligence at work here, which would have been called 3 or 4 centuries ago a witty mind. Do you see yourself in this light? Is that a fair assessment?
I think it is in a certain respect. We were just at an event, which you'll remember because you were there, but we were just at an event to launch this book, and after that event one of my old teachers came up to me, Jerry Baird, and I hadn't seen him for quite a while. Another one of my teachers I'm much more regular contact with, and Jerry taught a number of figures to me in precisely these terms, so that it was the way that I thought of Donne. It was the way I thought of McCaig, and indeed, actually, it was the way I thought of Brecht as well. The way that Brecht constructed ideas was very much about the map of wit, the grasp of an interaction between the vocabulary and the intellect of the writer and the society and the social pressures of the time in which she found herself. That nexus was that was wit. Yes. Yes.
Because your poetry seems to me to answer T.S. Eliot's complaint about dissociation of sensibility, that he says kicked in with Milton.
Yes.
I think it's in Tradition and the Individual Talent, or it might be the Metaphysical Poets, one of these two essays. He says that for Donne, a thought and a feeling were the same thing. By the time we get to Milton and then beyond him to Browning and Tennyson, thought and feeling have been decanted from each other in some way that Eliot hoped could be resolved. And I kind of see your writing as aspiring to that condition of being analytic, sharp, intelligent, and yet strong feeling at the same time, with no way of separating out these two things.
I think that I recognise very strongly, that idea. Yes, that things are not opposed in an A and not A style. They are usually for me, ideas and concepts and feelings and emotions are in a very strong, intimate dialogue with each other, which is the same idea that I think we've been referring to several times in this conversation, that Scots and English are not separate. You know, they can be regarded and defined as two languages, but they're not separate languages because we're doing both of them all the time. The genders are not separate in this culture.
They're both dialects of Anglo-Saxon.
Yes, that's fine. Yeah,
English,
that's fine.
Scots.
Yeah, it's fine. It's much more productive to think what will these things say to each other than how do these things differ from each other. A kind of categorization to separate does never strongly appeal to me.
Well, your last collection, Amnesia, which you've already flashed at the camera a couple of times, this is an unusual move to put out two books of poetry simultaneously with a considerable overlap and non-overlap, and no way of knowing which one should read first, or which one is a variant on the other. How did you arrive at this unusual approach to this recent collection?
I think it was a bit of a daydream actually. I remember I was going to do an event in Galway, in the Coach festival in Galway City, and I had about half an hour before I was supposed to turn up. And I'd been worrying about this, because effectively I'd had this option where I could have produced two separate books several years apart, and I'd held on to that kind of first book because it was too nascent, it wasn't complete. And as I got to the point where, as I was producing at the same rate, so as I got to the point where the second book would have appeared, I suddenly realised that I had a kind of a crisis brewing, where I'd have to rethink the way that these structures were being put together in my work, and I just had a wee nap in the Merrick in Galway, a lovely hotel, and when I woke up, I had the idea. It was there. It was.
So there's a lot to be said for sleeping on it.
Oh, I think there's a great deal to be said for creative procrastination.
I believe in this.
That's
why I never write.
Put it off. Just forget about it. Don't get your guilt out too soon in the process. Don't let the inner censor trample all over things. Just go to the pub. Go to the cinema. Go to the coffee shop. Go for a walk. And forget about it. Do the crossword. Do the wee resostics that you can get on Twitter now. Put your brain, the bit of your brain that's constantly telling you off about things, out of the picture for a bit, and everything else will either resolve or not resolve itself, and you just have to live with the consequences. So I saw a book which wasn't a single book, which was two books which were haunting each other, which were kind of doppelgangers of each other, and not one of them was the dominant book. They were both in this kind of opposition, they were both in this dialogue, and it seemed to me that that was a kind of a resolution of a problem I'd had for a long time about English and Scots and comic and serious and performance and page and all of these kinds of oppositions. Because of course, Derrida teaches us that when we've got these kinds of things which appear to be equals, these two ideas which appear to be opposed to each other in an equal way, it very rarely is a matter of equality. It's usually the case that one of them is actually dominating the other in some more suspect, power-based or political sense. So, therefore, English and Scots, it's never the case that those are entirely equal, is it? Male and female. There are certain power structures which are underlying those apparently equal oppositions. And so it's actually an interesting gesture to try and create something where there is an equality, where the experimental and the mainstream are in a kind of tension, but it's an equal tension rather than the case that we know to be that we just had the T.S. Eliot shortlist, and of course there's a certain kind of book on that list, and there's a lot of other kinds of books which are just not on it, and that's not to say that the books that are on that list aren't marvellous, because it's a very good and strong year, but we know the facts of that sort of situation. So I thought when I woke up from my swoon in Galway, there we go, I could do that. Can I persuade my publisher to do that? And
well,
that
this
was
what was on my mind. How did you persuade your publisher to go for a two-volume collection of a peculiar kind? Did they take much to bring them round?
I think probably just sort of lying to him about it was the simplest way of it. No, not at all. No, we had a good conversation. We had an interesting conversation about how it related to what interests him about my work, and we kind of agreed that there was a continuity, that it was a kind of a logical development of the way that my books have kind of been doubling in a kind of amoeba-like fashion. They've been separating out into more and more parts over the years, and so it seemed possible.
Well, Bill, it seems appropriate to conclude our conversation by asking you if you would to read something that you particularly like from one of your two Amnesia volumes.
Okay.
If you would.
Well, why don't I read the title poem, which has that doubling built into it, in that it's a dialogue between the poor poet and the figure of Amnesia. I should say that the Amnesia itself is a kind of portmanteau word combining omniscience and amnesia. The idea that increasingly knowledge is growing shallower. We think we know more because we can access more, but in fact our retention and our analysis of it is growing weaker and shallower. So it's a state of knowing everything but remembering nothing, which has both advantages and disadvantages as a way of describing the modern mind. So Amnesia as a personage, as a kind of personification, I see as a rather kind of strict and disapproving medieval allegorical figure, a female figure, rather powerful, and the poet is a male loser. So the poem goes from one voice to the other voice, which I shall try and convey by shifting in my seat. I can do it that way round. Amnesia. I left my bunnet on a train. Glenmorangie upon the plain. I dropped my notebook down a drain. I failed to try or to explain. I lost my gang but kept your chain. Say, shall these summers come again? Omnesia? You'd like to think it's God that sees ya while he's painting the parrots of Polynesia. Give your wife that fragrant freesia and not the eye of blind Omnesia. I scrabbled here and scribbled there, a sphere of peers declined to care. I roomed with hibernating bears and roamed where cartoon beagles dare. Protect me by not being there, Our Lady of congealed despair, Omnesia. You'd like the universe to please ya, your admin duties to be easier. Instead you grip the pole that's greasier, the shin bone of unskinned Omnesia. I wibbled there and wobbled here, forgot the 1000th name of beer. I filled my head with clashing gears and tried to live in other years. I passed on fame, selected fear, watered your name with poor Bill tears, Omnesia. So you lack ambition, and pelf don't tease ya. Still, me memed mugwump prats police ya, and Brit farce forces queue to seize ya for the purloined pearls of Aunt Omnesia. I'd like to think the muse remembers, not that teaching starts in late September, but the first of fires, dying embers, that glow on Cleopatra's members, my further lovers' choric timbres. Did I fiddle with their numbers, Omnesia? You hope it isn't fate who knees ya, the ship of fools which makes you queasier, or Mr. Scythe come to ease ya into the arms of Dame Omnesia.
Bill Herbert, thank you very much for your readings and your insights, and it's just great to have you as Dundee's marker, all that energy that you're going to bring to this post. Thank you very much.
Thank
Bill.
you very much.